the camera, my name is Greg Peterson, and I am the chairman of the Memorial Committee of the Jamestown Bar Association, and in that role, I am calling together a special meeting of the Jamestown Bar Association to celebrate the life of Arthur N. Bailey. I would ask that, by the way, this is being broadcast by Zoom. And the order of the day is I will be reading an excerpt from the obituary of Arthur N. Bailey, and then I will be reading a couple of letters that I received. I will then show a video which has certain excerpts of interviews, plural, I did with Mr. Bailey. And then we'll open it up for comment. And everybody, I welcome anybody who wants to talk about, share stories, even if they're not true, but just share. It's okay. As we do, we'll adjourn, and the transcript of this will be provided by Jerry Leneke, who's coming out of retirement to do this specifically, and to make sure Art, you, and the family have that as well. And this, likewise, is being broadcast, so know that, and I know you will use your discretion when you talk. So with that in mind, here's an excerpt from the obituary that appeared in the Post-Journal. The nationally prominent local attorney Arthur N. Bailey of 2407 South Hill Drive, Jamestown, New York, passed away Friday, February 29th, 2025 in Jamestown. A Jamestown resident since 1961, he was born May 4th, 1935 as the eldest son of the late Arthur J. Bailey and the late Macy Berkey Bailey. He was a 1953 graduate of Salamanca High School, a 1956 graduate of the University of Buffalo, and a 1959 graduate of the University of Buffalo School of Law, as well as of several subsequent medical and legal institutes. His legal career commenced in Jamestown as a partner in Van Vleck, Goodell, and McKee, where he replaced Charles E. Goodell, the great congressman and U.S. Senator, a law firm he later acquired and merged into the firm of Ledestro and Bailey. He soon became nationally recognized by specializing in the modern cutting-edge practice in the fields of medical, legal, products liability, and medical negligence malpractice actions. He soon became very active in the American Trial Lawyers Association, where he was elected as the youngest ever national director from New York, and was elected to the executive committee for 8 consecutive years by ALTA's board, during which he also was elected as an honorary member of the Trial Lawyers of California, West Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, Colorado, San Francisco, and of the First Amendment Trial Lawyers Association. In addition, he was honored to be an invited lecturer at the annual CLE seminars of 43 of the United States and of the foreign countries. He became a prolific writer in these specialized areas of law, having become editor of the Class Action Law Journal of ATLA, as well as 2-term president of the National Class Action section thereof, having held more than 265 elected or appointed positions. He was a lifelong member of the Jamestown Bar Association, the New York State Bar Association, and the American Bar Association. In addition, he successfully became a member of the Federal Practicing Bar of the Northern District of California, the Federal Bar of Minnesota, the Northern District of Illinois in Chicago. He was also a pro hoc vice member of the federal court in every United States Circuit Court of the United States. More recently, he has been recognized as having been the first filer or shared leadership in more federal class actions than any other individual lawyer in the United States. Mr. Bailey also became elected president of every school, college, law school, professional organization he ever belonged to, and during his year as president of the Jamestown Bar Association, he founded the Robert H. Jackson Center Inn of Court, together with its People Law School, where he gifted local lawyers could teach average citizens the fundamentals of law in classroom setting. Unquestionably, Mr. Bailey believed that his highest and best accomplishments was being the first ever to collect, read, and assemble every decision and major speech authored by Robert H. Jackson during his United States Supreme Court tenure, and to donate them along with the other early founders to the Robert H. Jackson Center, and thereafter to become recognized director and donor. And most importantly, to see it all grow into the now internationally famous institution, seemingly continuing so into the future. I'll just pause for a quick second. That behind that curtain is a bench which he paid for, which was used by the federal district courts and is used by the appellate division courts. And it's a tremendous piece of furniture, but he funded it individually. There's a plaque noting that, and that if we had the time and the energy, we'd bring it out to show it to you, but know full well that it's been shown on YouTube and stuff. Going on. First and foremost, he was a devoted husband, father, son, and brother. He is survived by his wife, Joanne Bailey, whom he married on March 10th, 1960, a son, Arthur N. Bailey, Jr., a practicing attorney in San Francisco, California, and thank you for coming, Art. A daughter, Darlene Kennedy, a practicing CPA in Chicago, Illinois, and a daughter, Kimberly A. Ward, a special ed teacher and behavior analyst in Oklahoma City, now residing in Jamestown, New York. He's also survived by 3 grandchildren, Alex Ann Kennedy of Lebanon, New Hampshire, Dr. Lauren Nash Kennedy of Kansas City, Missouri, and Dayton M. Ward of Jamestown, New York. The obituary is online, and the full obituary will be part of the transcript as well. Dear friends, the sad news was coming, but that does not make it any easier. Arthur Bailey was a person of so many significant dimensions. He made sure that I knew, a proud native of Niobe, New York. He was so smart, very hardworking, eloquent lawyer. He made Jamestown his home and loved the place. He was an accomplished, significant lawyer nationally, and in his cases, in his travels, in his contacts, and in his interest and concern. And Art Bailey thus revered Robert H. Jackson as his role model in all of these parallels. Small-town boy, gifted, learner, competitor, lawyer, Jamestowner, thinker, big voice, and a man on the large stage. It was so important to Art to serve on the Robert H. Jackson Center board. He cared about the Jackson Center intensely, supported it generously, and was determined, I am sure, to his last breath, that it be great for Jamestown and region and for the world. Attached is a photo of Art that I took last July where we were both at the Robert H. Jackson Center board. I feared it sadly had turned out to be correctly that it would be the last time that I saw him in person. We had telephone and Zoom calls thereafter. And I have numerous Art letters, Art emails, and my notes of calls from Art, all keepers. I always will remember and be inspired by Art Bailey. I will hear his booming voice. I was lucky to know him and to have him as my colleague and friend. With deep condolences to all who had the good fortune to have Arthur N. Bailey in their lives. Sincerely, John Q. Barrett, Professor of Law and the Robert H. Jackson lecturer. I also have another letter. Dear Greg, I regret that my prior travel plans will preclude my attendance at Art's memorial service and hope that you will share my condolences with our colleagues and Art's family. I've had the privilege of knowing Art Bailey for nearly 50 years, initially as the patriarch of his children and my longtime friend Art Jr., Darlene, and Kimberly, and later as a fellow attorney and colleague. Although the nature of our respective practices created only minimal professional interaction, I've always had the greatest respect and admiration for Art's abilities. My family has always enhanced my grandfather's motto that the ability to express oneself is among the greatest gifts of all. Art took that gift to a new level. He possessed the unique ability to effectively argue absolutely any point before anyone at any time. No recipient of a letter from Art could ever wonder from whom it came. His generous use of quotation marks and footnotes is legendary. The legal profession has lost a true giant. Respectfully, Stephen J. Wright. With that, we're going to pause, and we're going to see a vignette. These are two. One is a vignette from a speech Art gave to the board of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And then secondly, a small portion of Art reflecting on his early life, which is part of about 7 hours of interviews, if you're interested in seeing that.
I've wanted to be on this board ever since the day I came back to Jamestown to practice law in '61, because the dean of my law school made me promise, him personally, that when I went to Jamestown, I would immediately set out to make Robert H. Jackson a big part of that community's identity. I remember paying a secretary, which I couldn't afford, day after day after day, to copy on an old-fashioned photocopy machine every decision that Robert Jackson ever decided or participated in deciding, plus all of his other speeches, which, for those of you who have not read them, are more impressive. They hit you in the gut, in the heart, in the brain, more than the decisions do, which impress only lawyers. I'm talking about everybody. And I urge you to do it. And I'm telling you now, if I ever fail this organization, and I think every one of you prior and present directors fail this organization, it will be because you did not look far enough into the future to see what the Jackson Center should look like then. And my father did not go to college, but he went to four-year college. He attended with my aunts at Jamestown Business College. I got one story which you cannot get on the tape, but my father was always clever. He was a good speaker and a frequent speaker. And at the time when I was growing up and going to college, I felt quite superior to him and everybody else that didn't go to college. Ron and I had done well in economics. Ron was pontificating about, Mr. Bailey, Art has told me about how terrible your Depression days were and everybody around you. And now that economics has been invented, just like we invented it then, if they had known then what we know now, that whole depression was not necessary. And my dad listened, didn't argue with him. And finally he pipes up and says, Ron, you're down here to hunt deer this weekend, right? Yes. And he said, did you ever notice when you're trailing deer that their waste droppings are just little pellets? And even though they're a big animal. And yeah, no, I know. I know how to track deer, and I know that. And my father then said to him, well, did you ever notice when people keep horses, their waist is always in a ball, a horse ball. And then he mentioned a cow and carried that out. And he said, Ron, do you know why that is? No, I don't have any idea. And my father said, almost in a shout, that's just what I thought. Here, you don't know shit, and you're trying to teach me about economics.
You were born when? What's your date of birth?
5/4/35, 1935.
So you went to school in Iowa? Was there a class?
No. We were always bused to Panama.
Okay. Halloween, 1947. The book talks about the book Dreaming of a Roller Coaster by your mother. Talks about a person who will assume is you. Could you describe a little bit about your experience?
Actually, the whole country lived in fear of polio. It was a big thing then. And there used to be radio broadcasts saying, don't worry individually because only 1 out of every 1,000,000 kids comes down with polio. And I used to be greatly comforted by that because, God, how big is 1,000,000? It was beyond infinity to a 10 or 12-year-old brain. Well, that statistic is not very comforting if you happen to be that one kid. And I was that kid. And I remember Halloween, I laid down just because I had a bad headache or didn't feel good. But I did go to sleep. And the next morning, when I got up, my mother came into the bedroom and said, Artie, you got to get up. And I did get up. And when I got off the bed and stood up, I went down in a heap because my legs wouldn't hold me up. And she called immediately Dr. Grant, A.A. Grant over in Sugar Grove. And said this, and he said to her, Macy, I'm not going to come all the way over there to tell you, but this sounds awfully much like polio, and you better get him into the hospital, Jamestown General Hospital, right away. And he said, matter of fact, I'm going to have an ambulance come all the way out there, and you have them packed and ready. And my father just got home from Salamanca about the time the ambulance arrived, and he carried me out so the ambulance guys didn't have to come in, and they put me on where I'm laying down, and I'll even remember looking up and seeing all of the tree leaves passing over my head as I'm looking out the top of it. First vehicle I was ever in that had a glass top. First time I ever saw my father cry was when he told the ambulance driver to get him into the hospital right away because we think he has polio. And I sure did. The Jamestown General Hospital then had a quarantined section, which was the perfectly round sun porch. On the end, even today, when I drive over 3rd Street Bridge, I look across and see that sun porch where all the polio patients were. And from that trip until the next many months later, the only view I ever got of my parents or my brothers was through a mirror, which was a piece of metal, shiny metal like chrome, through a visitor's window because we were all quarantined. And they believed in what was called the Sister Kenny, Kenny, treatment, which was very hot packs of wool blankets put into a steamer. And a lot of times they'd get it too hot and it would blister. That only happened to me a few times. But Russell B. Erickson used to say to me, the best way to keep anybody from feeling down in the dumps, which is a shirt sleeve word, but early depressions, is to keep them busy in something interesting. And so almost immediately, I started writing the Polio Press. And I made each one of the kids responsible for contributing something. On Halloween night, or actually next morning, and I got out after the kids had already had their school year finished.
You gave it a walkout?
Pardon me?
We gave it a walkout.
If that's your only question, the answer is yes. But how did you walk out? I had a full-length brace from my ankle all the way up to my hip, and with a lock on the knee. So it was perfectly stiff. And it was easy to pull up a lever and unlatch it so it would bend. But if you ever did that, by accident or otherwise, when you were standing up, it was ugly. And from 12 years old until this morning, I've always had a protruding abdomen. And Lucian Ledestro used to say to me, if there's anybody on this earth that can convince anybody else that you're not fat, you've got a weakened abdominal wall, I'm going to use that, Art. I'm going to use that. And he said, but you're a fat bastard nevertheless, okay? Has this hurt me? Is it painful? Was it ever painful? The truthful answer is no. I think I've endured modest or greater pain so long that you come to think that that's part of life. But to say any of those things ever were painful? The answer is no.
So you read your mother's book, Macy Jane Bailey, Dreaming of on a Roller Coaster, Never Give Up Your Dreams, and we both did. And if you read it now, what would be the takeaway for you? I mean, this is your basically biography.
Rather than try to characterize it, here is the experience that it's had. Most people and most buyers of it bought it because it's inspirational. In Montana and other western states, they bought several of them as a motivating or inspirational. To me, it's just things that happened. And I was lucky. I'd go so far as to say I was lucky to have been stricken with polio because it made me start thinking, which I never did before. At an age 10, 11, 12, in that range, I would think, God, how am I going to take care of myself when I get out of here?
And the answer, he did. He did successfully and amazingly. So I want to share with you a little bit of the backstory of Art Bailey. We knew him professionally, somewhat, most of us somewhat personally, but maybe not that story. And that kind of that, what is it that makes a person? And that's kind of what my feeling was, what made Art Bailey so unique, driven, and many of the attributes that John Barrett mentioned in his letter. With that, I'm going to pause and open it up to the membership and guests. Thank you. Many of you have traveled great distances to come here today. Thank you. You're all welcome to share a story if you'd like, or more. Phil Calla, as shy as you are, come on up.
For the record, Phil Calla. Okay. So I'm going to share 3 facets of Arthur's personality and identity, one of which we're almost all familiar with. The other 2 might surprise you. So Art and I had a long-running battle about writing style and the use of language, and he'd send me a memo or a letter. It would have footnotes in it. And I'd walk over to his office and I'd say, Art, you got to understand, I said, I realize you're a different generation, but when I went to law school, they taught us this thing called plain English. They discouraged the use of, gratuitous Latin phrases, things like that. And, I think, and maybe Teresa knows a little bit about this because she was there, Art's secretary. She was there, I think, when he got his feature on his word processor that let him put footnotes into letters, things like that. So anyway, we had this ongoing argument. I'd always argue for clarity and succinctness, and he would respond to me by saying things like, Phil, they're just words. And, he'd dictate a 6-page letter that you could have done in 6 paragraphs. He used to, he knew I was an English lit major, and he knew that, or had heard that some of my law school friends who were on law review would have me edit their work for style, grammar, punctuation, etc. And so he would appeal to my expertise and send briefs and things that he was working on to my office on the pretense that he wanted me to edit them. He really just wanted me to read them. And I figured that out after, probably upwards of 100 pages of various documents. And, I'd mark them up and edit them, make comments, and he'd never make a single change, never. So I said, Art, I understand what you're doing. You just want me to read this thing. Just ask me. Tell me you want me to read it instead of putting me to all the work and trouble it takes to edit these things, because editing your stuff is like, it's a marathon. And he said this to me, and he knew this by heart. I got to read it. I said, Art, I was criticizing him about about his verbosity and whatnot, and how he sometimes tortured the language. He responds like this. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, nothing more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master? That's all. He knew that by heart. So one of the other things that some of us will remember were Arthur's Supreme Court appearances. If you had business in the courthouse on a day when Art was there, if you saw Art, you would go into the courtroom if you had time to see what he had cooking that day, because it was always entertaining. So my one war story about that is a case he had where during the course of discovery, some key piece of evidence, documentary evidence, was accidentally sent to his opponent. And it took some time for that to come out. And Arthur then, I think, made some application to probably dismiss the case or for some other sanction. And I was present for the oral argument on that. His opponent was trying to justify himself and excuse himself with the court, which Judge Ricotta was not very happy. I believe it was Judge Ricotta. And the attorney said, well, I guess I had a moral dilemma. And because we all know that when something like that happens, you're supposed to not read it, immediately notify the other party anyway. So that didn't happen for a couple weeks. Anyway, so Art got up to rebut, and he said, Your Honor, my opponent tries to excuse his behavior by saying he had a moral dilemma. It's the same moral dilemma that Willie Sutton had every time he walked by a bank. All right. Here are the things you may not know about Art. If I were to tell you that he had a big pro bono practice, and by big pro bono practice, I don't mean that he did free legal work for people or did work as we all have done and not gotten paid. He did it for free. And he just couldn't resist standing up for an underdog. There was something about that just triggered something in him. I sent, I wouldn't say many clients, but I sent several clients to him. It usually was the same type of thing. Some client would come in, they'd have a problem that was beyond my depth, and as I did with so many such cases, I'd call Art up. Art, what should I do with this guy? Where should I send him? What should I tell him? Send him over here. Send the guy over. So this one client in particular came in to see me, and he said his parents had succumbed to one of these traveling roofing companies where they tell you don't have to pay a penny down and blah, 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 and they'll put a new roof on. They put the roof on, but then you're mortgaged for the rest of your life. So Art took this case for this old couple, and I never heard about it until sometime later when my client said, Phil, thanks so much for sending me to Mr. Bailey. What a guy. I said, about what? He said, you remember I said, yeah, the roofing case. He said, Mr. Bailey made that go away. And my parents are so grateful. And that was something that Art did on many occasions. And I think you know that he was kind of renowned for defending foreclosures and not just stopping the foreclosure, but getting the note mortgage discharged. And most of that work, he didn't ask for pay. And unlike me, he didn't get the client qualified at legal aid so that you at least got continuing legal education credit for the hours you put in. So we'll move on to the third facet, probably the least known, and something that was not apparent to me until I attended his memorial service with his family at Lynn's. And that is his devotion to family. I always thought that Art had no life outside of the law. But I was pleased and gratified to learn, listening to his children, his grandchildren, talk about their grandfather and just what a wonderful, supportive man he was in everything that they chose to do and how he would facilitate their interests with encouragement and financing if need be. Now, one of the grandkids mentioned that he just wanted a better life for his kids. Maybe it was one of his daughters, I can't remember. But it reminded me of the stories Art would tell me about his childhood poverty. I'm not sure that they were impoverished, but he ran a trap line before school with his brother, and he would trap muskrats, and it was, extra income, and at that time, pretty significant amount of extra income. And he talked about how his little trapping operation improved the family's circumstances. It was really something to see the love and admiration and gratitude that was expressed by his kids and grandkids. I got to try and decipher my handwriting here. So, I guess I just want to say that the children's remarks painted a picture of a man, a devoted husband, father, grandfather, a man that most of us know as driven by singular ambition, but in reality was a desire to provide for his family with opportunity, and excel at a remarkable level. And evidence bears that out. Thank you. I'm going to miss my buddy Art.
Thank you. Greg Edwards?
Greg Edwards for the record, Jamestown, New York. Phil, thank you. You prefaced many of my observations as well. I had a distinct history with Art because he grew up, as noted, in Niobe, about 3 miles south of my father's parents' farm. About the same age, went to school at Panama about the same time. And so as a result, when I started thinking about law, my dad was aware of Art and his work and his history. And the beauty of that beginning back in the 1980s, when I first started into the law, is that it ended with the last 10 years of innumerable hours in Art's office at the Furniture Mart building, as my friends from his office will attest. And the opportunity to learn much of what you described, Phil. Because I think Art is the personification of an enigma. Because if you only knew Art from the courtroom, or if you only knew Art from one of his endeavors, you had a particular opinion, we'll call it, or observation. But I think that he mirrors, or is a demonstration of what is biblically true, that prophets aren't honored in their hometown. And for us here in Jamestown, what good can come from Nazareth? And I think Art personifies that because I would posit that he's probably, and I believe this, and maybe some of my remarks will help you, the second most famous lawyer to come out of Jamestown. I have some observations that may bear that out, and I'll certainly be glad to dig into this deeper after we wrap up today. But the challenge to try and capture Art in just a few moments is incapable of being done. But Art started out as an attorney and became a mentor and then ultimately a friend. And maybe some of my observations will help you understand him as well. I think one of Art's biggest challenges was that he couldn't help but polish any story or any fact because it wasn't quite as good as it needed to be in that very raw form. After Art got done with it, it was more like the Mona Lisa. And I think what happens then is that we all approach these stories, these observations, this work with that thought in mind. So I will tell you, the audience today, that almost everything I'll share with you has at least two sources, and many of them very accurate in their representations. So you can take this for what it's worth. I think people become lawyers for many reasons, as all of you who are lawyers all had your own unique reasons for becoming a lawyer. Maybe it's something that's a family tradition. Maybe it's something that is just a natural to you, or you had a mentor that was. I believe that polio, as he described, pushed Art in that direction because while he described it rather clearly, what you wouldn't know is that Art has never had the capacity or use of his right quadricep or his trapezius muscle, and he also has serious curvature of the spine. But that drove him more than it held him back. My father recalls that Art had the idea that he wanted to be an athlete and when he was young. But clearly polio changed that, and I'd encourage you. I tend to believe that might be more of an autobiography that was written than a biography. But you can get the full picture of his battle with polio from that. Something I didn't know about Art until spending those many hours with him is that Art was on the crossroads of either becoming a preacher or a lawyer. How did that happen? Art had an uncle who was a big deal in Akron. And as a child, he would travel to Akron because his uncle led the revivals they had in Akron. And for many years, it was Billy Graham who was the person who led that revival. And Art would delight in telling the stories about as a child sitting at the kids' table in his uncle's dining room, listening to Billy Graham, and then going to the revivals. And his booming voice has been already mentioned, but it was from that experience and also the experience during his first job of washing dishes at the Athenaeum, where Art, being the persuasive guy he was, convinced his aunt to lie. And she took that sin, as he believed it, to her deathbed, because she lied and said he was 16 when he was only 15 so he could get the job. But washing dishes there at the Athenaeum, many times on break, he would be outside the Athenaeum when the pastor who was giving the tours of the Holy Land, which the Chautauqua Institution has in perfect geographic representation, with a booming voice be telling people all about that. And Art had a copy of all of that in a cassette that he had in his office. And so at that time, he was going back and forth, but I think thankful for all of us in the experiences we've had, he chose the law. I went to UB. He went to UB Law School. He mentioned his experience there in his introduction to Robert Jackson. To add a little color commentary to that, as Art portrayed it, he said that he was a first-year law student there, and all of a sudden he gets a notice that Dean Heinemann wants to see him. And of course, as we all may have experienced, your brain immediately goes to, oh no, what do I do now? And am I going to be able to continue? And as it turned out, the dean had clerked for Robert Jackson and had developed, obviously, a real fondness for him. And when he learned that Arthur N. Bailey was from Jamestown, he put those two pieces together, and he and the dean reminisced and talked about that regularly, and maybe that led to what we heard about today. The other thing that was intriguing to me when he was, because I am aware of his, the challenge his family faced economically, is that he put himself through law school. One of the ways he did that was he took a part-time job. He took a part-time job on Saturday mornings at 6:30 a.m. calling racehorse races at the Buffalo Raceway. And typical to Art's form, he got the job. He studied other people who were calling races. He studied the jockeys. He studied how to call the races. He knew the colors of the horses. And he really went all in Saturday mornings calling these races. Towards the end of the season, he happened upon the largest owner of horses racing at the track there. And he stepped up and asked this gentleman, whose name I have here somewhere, so what do you think of my callings? And he says, son, I don't care what you say or what you do as long as it's loud and as noisy as you could possibly be. Because these were just horses who were just training. All they wanted to have those horses to hear that. And rounding the bend coming as they came up to the stands, because it was just trying to get them accustomed to the noise. But it was just another one of those opportunities he had to polish that booming voice that he listened to and learned from others, and we all experienced. But what I also had the opportunity to see was how persuasive, Phil, you mentioned it. I believe Judge Cass might have even been with me there that day, but we happened upon arguments in Mayville. And it was in front of Leetown, Judge Leetown Adams. And Art was arguing on behalf of debt on the Furniture Mart building. And I believe this is when it was portrayed as if Steve Pawnell was the owner, which we all knew wasn't the case. But there were two lawyers from Manhattan there in the courtroom with him that day. They were on the left, he was on the right. And I can distinctly remember the arguments going back and forth and back and forth. And Art wore him down. And in the end, Art convinced these two lawyers that they absolutely should not pursue their debt against the Furniture Mart building because of its asbestos, because of in this laundry list of things. At the end of the day, these two gentlemen had to go back and tell their client that they just waived a $2 million debt on the Furniture Mart building, and Art was certainly the benefactor of his talents on that particular day. Art's obituary talks a lot about his success. But at one point in time, and I had the distinct benefit for more than 10 years of working with him in the class action field through mentoring and helping him and working on some of his cases. But at one point in time, I was going to be called on, I knew, to represent Art and his capacity. And it always pays to have that second source. And so I said, all right, I mean, I can go in there and tell them these things, but they're going to say, where'd you hear that? And I'm going to tell them it's from you, so you got to give me a little help here. So he said, well, Greg, call John Cuneo from Washington, D.C. He said, you ask John who I am and what I do in the class action field. Here's what John Cuneo said, and I'll tell you who he is. Art's a senior statesman, has a tremendous national reputation, and these are quotes from him, a great advocate. Everyone in the national class action field knows and respects him. He's knowledgeable, seasoned, regularly joint ventures with other firms as lead counsel. Who was John? Lead counsel to Enron. Opioid cases as well. He was a boxer who boxed against Muhammad Ali and Jerry Cooney. His funeral was at the National Cathedral. I think that was a pretty good second source. I also was in Art's office when he would pick up the phone and call David Boyce. And some of you may know that name, but you think about US versus Microsoft or Bush versus Gore or the Theranos case, and David would pick up. And because Art's phone was easily heard in his office, I would have the pleasure of listening to them. And then also Mike Hausfeld, another leader in the class action law field. He was with Art, lead counsel for the Swiss Holocaust victims class action. Also the Blue Cross Blue Shield class action where the settlement was $2.67 billion, fees in excess of $667 million. And he did, in fact, file more cases in the federal court on behalf of farmers than anyone else, including the Department of Justice and the United States government. He told me just a couple years ago, if I just had another 10 years, because that was just shortly after that Blue Cross Blue Shield case had been settled with that award, and there were more on his way. But Phil, you're absolutely right. The part that I enjoyed the most was learning about his commitment to his family and his faith, because that's not what he portrayed, because his profession was to be the litigator and was prolific and effective at that. But I too had a window into it prior to hearing it directly from his kids. But at that moment and since then, I've come to understand that he was as active and intent on his role as a father and grandfather. And the pro bono work is just, even at the moment he died, he had 19 cases, of which I think one of them was paying on the civil side. Art, you're shaking your head, you know that to be true, in addition to the 40 or more class actions that he had in the works. And it was a treat and an honor to spend that much time with him. Thank you.
I'll call, before I call up anybody else, just a footnote to, appropriately a footnote to Greg Edwards. Art was very proud to pass out this article. It's called The Art of Plaintiff's Class Action Antitrust Law, published by The Milkweed, December of 2021. And within it recounts Art's prolific antitrust cases, including cases dealing with potatoes and wheat. And potatoes, by the way, is entitled Berjota's Farmland Produce and Garden Center, Inc. versus United States Potato Growers of Idaho, Inc. That's one of the cases. And the balloon that's pulled out in the article said, astonishingly, it seems fair to state that Arthur Bailey has probably engaged in more actual antitrust lawsuits during the past 4 decades than the entire antitrust division of the United States Department of Justice. Amazing. Any other comments? Kristen?
This is the first one of these that I've ever spoken at, which also seems fitting. Arthur was a deeply committed board member, and we tend to measure those in the 3 T's: time, talent, and treasure. He attended every board meeting, every committee meeting. He was always present. When we moved to Zoom, the technology learning was fun to watch. usually someone in the office would have to help set it up. And I'll close my little chat here today with how he would always end each of those. He also attended every event we had here, and as many out of the area as he could possibly get to. Most of the time, especially if it was out of the area, he wouldn't tell me he was coming. He would just walk in the door. And I always appreciated that support for the work that the center was doing. You've heard a little bit about the treasure that he has contributed to the center already. We've mentioned the beautiful bench that is behind the curtain. He also started and contributed to an endowed fund to help benefit the center, and always was ready with support. But it's really the talent that I want to talk about. You've heard about one of his very first projects was to gather every opinion and every speech, and we have those in our archives, and they are an invaluable resource to our staff team and our interns who need to learn that every year. He had plans, large, small, for how to increase the reach of the center, for how to raise its prominence, and it's everything from how the center could become a Cyprea recipient, to a global antitrust forum here, to connections with individual lawyers and firms. I can remember within my first couple of months here, he was sitting with me at the front desk, and he's like, oh, well, we'll just get him on the phone. And he starts dialing, and I actually think it was John Cuneo that he was calling. He's like, John, you've got to meet Kristen. And we had this conversation over the cell phone on, I think, like a Saturday morning. And I just remember thinking, if this is the kind of board that supports the work here, how lucky am I to lead this organization? And he listened a lot in meetings. He wouldn't speak, well, let me think how to phrase this, because he would speak a lot, but he wouldn't necessarily speak often. He would synthesize, not summarize, but synthesize the conversation in a direction that helped the board crystallize their thinking, and his voice was always one that commanded attention. On a personal note, I actually started my legal practice with Howry in Washington, D.C. in the antitrust practice group. And that was a great conversation starter with Arthur all of the time. He had been on the other side of Howry antitrust attorneys on a number of occasions, and I think gratefully his respect for that firm conveyed to me. So when we had those conversations, it was always as peers. And whenever he was working on a case, well, usually just after he had filed the case, I would get a copy of whatever it was he'd been working on. And every time I came to his office to talk to him, I would leave with something. And I remember one time leaving with, I believe it was at least 300 plus page filings. And I thought, okay, I cannot let that much time elapse between visits with Arthur anymore, because that was a lot of reading to try and do. And he always challenged me to think differently and creatively, which is vital in this role, because you get sometimes just on a path and you start having those blind spots, and he would always be poking and always be sending ideas to me. You've heard a few times during his family mentioned during the memorial service, and they specifically mentioned how much care he took with them and how present he was for them. And that helped me realize that he thought of the center and of me as family as well. He was always fully present. He always took my calls. And I was always able to walk into his office and interrupt whatever it was he was doing. And I had not truly realized how exceptional that was until I heard his family speak at the memorial. So, Arthur would end every Zoom call with these words: "Thus endeth the lesson." And he continues to teach me, and then he would close the laptop. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Anybody else want to share a thought before we conclude? I'm delighted to have had so many family and friends who came distances, and Arthur, we're delighted you could join us, and Teresa, and I'm just delighted the firm could come, because nobody knows more and stories and how to do footnotes than you do. Andy?
First, thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Phil, for your comments. I didn't know Art very well, and so I'm just going to share two little stories. Many years ago, probably 20 or more, I attended the Jamestown Bar Association meeting right here in this building. And I sat next to Art. And I always enjoyed listening to Art. And so Art made a motion to dispense with the reading of the minutes. And his explanation was longer than the minutes. And he convinced us. And I was hoping that the next set of minutes wouldn't include his discussion of why we should waive the minutes. Then, much more recently, just a couple months ago, I was appointed as a referee in a mortgage foreclosure. And as you would expect, after I was appointed referee and the court ordered foreclosure and the appointment of the referee, Art got involved, and that resulted in a slew of motions to set aside the mortgage foreclosure. And out of curiosity, I read one of his motions. And it was fun reading. It used more Latin than I've ever read in my entire life, to the point where I actually had to start looking up Latin to understand what Art was getting at. And then after several pages of verbose, did I say that? Extensive argument, Art shifted tempo entirely. And he said, in other words, the plaintiff's arguments are absolute baloney. And he used the most direct, common language to deride the plaintiff. And I just couldn't help it. I was alone in my office. I just burst out laughing. And for me, that encapsulated Art. In many ways, for me, Art's passing was an end of an era. Yeah, Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Ander, Ledestro, Bailey, and Erickson, right? All those great firms when I started. And Art was certainly, in a league all by himself, not just locally, but nationally. Thank you.
Well, I'm almost getting emotional here. I always felt with Art like I was certainly out of league, and I feel kind of out of league here with some of the speakers here before me today. But I guess it might have been almost 30 years ago now, Art asked me if I'd like to take a trip to Atlanta with him on a carpet price fixing case. So I was game. We went to Atlanta, got a hotel room on like the 14th floor of this nice hotel. I was feeling kind of heady, so the next morning we go out the front door to cross the street, and we go up to like the 21st floor to meet with the partners of this law firm, and then spend the next several days, at least I did, on the 20th floor with several other attorneys going through boxes, a whole room full of boxes for discovery. And Art was explaining to them all what he wanted to see, particularly things like logs, calendars. He said, look for private plane logs. He was trying to put the carpet companies all in one place at one time, looking for some collusion. And, when we met with the senior partners, he was explaining to them what was going to happen here and what he was looking for, and they were all listening to Art. So I guess, there were times when Art was talking, I wasn't certain exactly how much was truth and how much was fiction, but I was certainly impressed with his work there and the fact that he included me in that. And of course, I've had plenty of dealings with him, and he was always so nice. He'd always bring up the facts that we were both members of the, alumni of UB Law School, and we were both English majors along the way, or at least that was, and would again, throw things out at me that I couldn't ever see coming, but he was always gracious with me, and I guess nice to have been included in his company from time to time. Thank you.
Your Honor.
Hi, for the record, Steve Cass. I have several really good war stories, but I'm only going to pick one today. And so probably around 1989, 1990, when Greg and I practiced together, and Phil was in the Furniture Mart building, and John Samuelson on the second floor, and we were all there. And when we would go to Mayville, and it was Art's turn to argue a case, everybody would come and watch. And it was spectacular. So I remember one particular case, and this happened to be in front of Ricotta in Supreme Court, and I do not recall what he was arguing, but I do remember that all of a sudden it was the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And Custard was advancing from the left with the cavalry, and Sitting Bull was setting up a trap, and Crazy Horse was over here. And I thought all of a sudden, I don't know whether I'm in a history lesson or a legal argument, but it was riveting, and everybody was watching. The case ended. Somehow Art connected the whole thing, and I walked into Judge Ricotta's chambers as the first attorney on the following case. Judge Ricotta's court reporter was Tom Muldowney, and Ricotta said, Tommy, get me a copy of that transcript. I got to read that again. Get me a copy of that transcript. And Tony Leone was the court clerk, the court attorney. And Tony came out and said, Judge, you know that was all bullshit, right? That whole thing? And Ricotta said, I know, but it sounded so good, I got to read it again. And the beauty of that, Arthur understood, was that the judge read it again, looked at his arguments a second time, understood the connection, and he got that second look. And when he looked at it, I'm sure the judge saw the connection. And Arthur had that beautiful ability to get somebody, at first time they would say, as Greg eloquently said, they polished the facts a little bit. But when you started to drill down into it, Arthur really knew what he was doing. He was a brilliant lawyer, wonderful family man. I'll miss him.
As we draw closure, just a few personal notes. Because much of this was touched today, and Kristen, who's the president, CEO of the Robert H. Jackson Center, talked about Art showed up. We did an event, the Jackson Center did an event at the Supreme Court. We were in front of the Supreme Court, and I was one of the speakers, and John Barrett was one of the speakers, really heady day. And all of a sudden, there in the audience, unannounced, was Arthur. He was not on the board. He was just there to capture the moment. Secondly, we also took a whole group of people to Nuremberg. Robert Jackson, chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial. And there was the family. And I don't know if you were part of that, but I know your sister was. And there's the family. There's Art, there's Joanne, there's a sister. They had Nuremberg as part of our group. John Cuneo. One thing, if you read the Wall Street Journal of the past week, there is a book review on John Cuneo's dad, Master Spy. And Art will talk about John Cuneo, his relationship with John Cuneo. And in fact, there's a relationship with John Cuneo's dad and Robert Jackson. And I actually tracked that down. And there's a book probably Teresa could find. It's probably in his office that I gave just last year about all that. Signed by John Cuneo with a Walter Winchell thing. But what I remember is you just saw, talk about serendipity, that little interview, portions of the interview of Art talking about his polio. During that interview, we paused. We paused that interview so we could listen to the funeral of John Cuneo that he had from the Washington Cathedral. Third thing, I'm a native of Jamestown, New York, and as such, did sports and the whole thing, and started playing football with Jamestown area Midget League football. And Art pulls out of his files one day a program, and there I am, Greg Peterson, with the Southside Blue Devils. But most importantly, the guy, and I now remember with distinction, who did all the volunteering of the announcing of all the Midget League football games, and in fact was the MC for every Midget League football banquet of the 3 or 4 that I attended, was Arthur Bailey. Art Bailey, he was there. He was using his voice. He was using that, probably he learned from his track days up there. Finally, I'm taking some privileges here, because I reflect very fondly of Art attending these events, these memorial services. And Art often would speak. Weren't quite sure whether he knew the person he was speaking about, but he would speak. Nevertheless, his point in every time he spoke, most recently at the Honorable Stephen Cass's father's funeral, celebration of life, of which he was the last speaker, sitting right over there, right over there. He took the microphone, took it, and he spoke about Judge Cass. But most importantly, he spoke about the fact of the Jamestown Bar Association doing what we are currently doing, pausing, reflecting on our fellow colleagues, having a moment in time where we can celebrate the lives of our own colleagues and how important it is to the bar, how important it was to Art, because at some time it might involve Art. It does today. I'm sure he would be proud of what we've accomplished today. And I say to the bar, job well done, mission accomplished, go forth. Thank you. With that, we will stand adjourned, and Art, know full well we'll have a transcript of this, and this video will be at some point up on YouTube.